everyone, we're diving deep into the LA real estate market today. I know a lot of you are probably thinking about those crazy wildfires. So I've been looking at this Los Angeles real estate market analysis, and it really gets into how these fires could totally change things. It goes way beyond just the immediate damage, and looks at the long-term stuff for both buyers and sellers.
Yeah, and we have to remember that LA was already kind of a mess housing-wise, even before the fires hit. Back in 2022, there was already a shortage of 337,000 homes. So this just adds another crazy layer to an already really stressed situation.
Totally. It's like adding fuel to the fire, right? This analysis asks some pretty big questions too, like will property values actually plummet? What are insurance companies doing about all this? And how are renters, who are usually the most vulnerable, going to be affected?
So one of the most interesting things this analysis brings up is how these wildfires affect property values. Studies show that even after a single fire, you could see values drop by 10%. But get this, after a second fire, it gets really intense. We're talking a potential 23% drop, and it could take 5 to 7 years for things to recover.
Whoa, 23%? That's a lot. I get that fire damage is bad, but what's making the value drop so much? Is it just the actual damage, or is there something else going on?
It's definitely more complicated than just the damage itself. You got to think about how investors feel. When an area gets hit by multiple fires, investors get spooked. They see it as a risky investment. So because there's less demand, prices go down. And then you have the long-term impact on the community. If businesses close down because of the fires and people move out, who's going to rebuild? It's that uncertainty that really affects property values.
That makes a lot of sense. And talking about uncertainty, this analysis talks about insurance premiums doubling in some places. It even mentions a $1 million home in California where insurance might have been $5,000 a year before the fires. Imagine that doubling.
Ouch is right. That increase alone could cause a 7% drop in property value. And it's not just hypothetical. The analysis talks about Pacific Palisades, which was hit by the fires last year. When State Farm canceled policies, their property values tanked by 16%. That was before these latest fires even happened. It shows just how much fear plays a role in all this.
Okay, so let's say I'm looking to buy a house. Would you recommend buying in a place with this much uncertainty, even if it seems like a good deal at first?
That's a tough one. There's always a risk versus reward thing with real estate.
Yeah.
You might find a place that looks like a steal because of fire damage or, the risk.
Yeah.
But you have to weigh that against the fact that values could drop even more. Insurance is going up, and who knows what's going to happen to the area in the future.
Let's say the worst happens. My house burns down. Most people just assume insurance will cover it, right? This analysis seems to say that's not always true. What's the reality there?
It definitely busts the myth that insurance is a magic fix. After a fire, it's not just about the damaged house. You're dealing with a whole bunch of problems. Destroyed infrastructure, skyrocketing rebuilding costs, and a giant question mark over the future of your community.
So it's not just rebuilding a house, it's rebuilding your life, rebuilding a community. That's a whole different thing. The analysis breaks down these post-fire challenges. What are the biggest ones for homeowners?
The analysis highlights 3 main problems: the destruction of community infrastructure, rebuilding cost, going through the roof, and the possibility that the whole community changes.
Okay, let's take those one by one. You mentioned destroyed infrastructure. What does that mean for someone who lost their home in a fire?
Imagine this. Your house is gone, but so are the local shops, schools, daycare centers, all those things that make a community work.
Yeah.
Those businesses might not come back, and that affects everything else.
So you're not just rebuilding your house, you're rebuilding your entire life, and there's no guarantee things will go back to how they were.
Exactly. And that takes us to the second challenge, rebuilding costs. It's not just about the cost of materials, which have been going up anyway. There are stricter building codes to deal with now, a shortage of construction workers, and a lot of times insurance doesn't even cover the full cost of rebuilding.
Hold on, stricter building codes. What does that mean practically?
Think of it this way. After a big fire, building codes get updated to make things more fire resistant. So instead of just replacing your old roof, you might have to use special fire resistant materials, or install sprinkler systems, or change your landscaping. It all adds up.
Wow, so you're dealing with the emotional stress of losing your home and this huge financial burden, too. And if that's not enough, you mentioned the community itself changing. What did you mean by that?
Well, think about who stays and who leaves after a major fire. Wealthy homeowners might just pack up and buy a fancy place somewhere else. Middle-class families might not be able to afford to rebuild, or might not want to wait years for things to get back to normal. Some people who have lived there forever might just be too overwhelmed to even think about coming back. So the community you knew might be totally different after everything is rebuilt.
It's like this chain reaction. One disaster leads to another, and the whole neighborhood could change. It's heartbreaking, especially for people who've called these places home for years.
It really is. And it's not just homes that are affected. Imagine you're a business owner and your whole livelihood is gone. You might take the insurance money and leave because you don't know if you'll ever have enough customers to justify rebuilding. The uncertainty makes it almost impossible to plan for the future.
So even if you want to stay and rebuild, it might be really tough.
Definitely. And this brings us to the bigger crisis that's happening in California. The analysis talks about three big hurdles: insurance companies leaving the state, the difficulty of getting mortgages, and these long-term risks that just keep getting worse.
Whoa, okay, let's break those down. What's happening with insurance companies in California?
We're seeing a mass exodus. 7 of the top 12 insurance companies have already pulled out of the California market.
Why are they leaving? Is it because of the fires?
It's mostly because of the growing risk from climate change. Insurance companies are looking at all the data and seeing how much more frequent and intense these wildfires are becoming. They're realizing that their old ways of assessing risk just don't work anymore. It's getting too expensive for them to insure properties in high-risk zones.
So they're basically saying, this is too risky, we're out of here.
Pretty much. And that's a huge deal for homeowners, especially in areas prone to fires.
This is a lot to take in. We've talked about the impact on property values, the challenges of rebuilding, and now this insurance exodus. I'm starting to see just how tangled up this whole situation is. This must have a domino effect on the entire housing market, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just about the people directly affected by the fires. The whole housing market ecosystem is impacted.
So this isn't just about a few houses burning down. We're talking about a potential system-wide shift in how real estate works in California.
Exactly. And it's a shift that will affect everyone, not just homeowners, but renters, businesses, and the entire state.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm really starting to understand how complex this all is. We've discussed the immediate impact of the fires, the long-term challenges of rebuilding, and this looming insurance crisis. Where do we go from here?
Well, next we should talk about the group that often gets hit the hardest in situations like this.
Right.
Renters. They're facing a whole set of unique problems. And to really understand how these fires are affecting the LA housing market, we have to understand what they're going through.
That's a great point. Let's shift gears and focus on renters. They're often forgotten in these conversations, but their situation is arguably the most unstable.
You're right. With more than 10,000 rental units gone, there are a ton of people who need a place to live. And when that happens, landlords going to raise prices.
So we could see rent going up, bidding wars for apartments, maybe even discrimination against people who lost their homes in the fires.
Yeah, all of that is possible. And on top of that, a lot of renters might not have had renter's insurance. So they lost everything and have no money to fall back on. They have to start from scratch in a market that suddenly becomes super competitive.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. This analysis even says that a lot of people might just leave LA altogether. They'll go somewhere more affordable or with fewer risks. But what about people who can't afford to move or who have jobs or family in LA? What are their options?
Well, the analysis has some advice for renters in LA right now. The biggest thing is to act quickly. Lock in your lease, even if it costs a bit more. See if you can work out a better deal with your landlord and start saving money, because rent is probably going to go up.
So basically, be proactive and protect yourself, because the market's going to get even more unpredictable. But what if you're already facing eviction or just can't pay the higher rent? What can renters do in those situations?
That's when it's super important to know your rights as a tenant. California has some of the strongest tenant protections in the whole country.
Yeah.
But you got to know what they are and how to use them. There are also legal aid groups that can help renters who are being evicted or treated unfairly.
So for our listeners out there who are renting in LA right now, what's the most important thing they should do? What's one thing they can do today to protect themselves?
Don't freak out, but don't just sit back and do nothing either. Now's the time to learn and be proactive. Find out about your rights as a renter. Get in touch with local tenant groups if you need help. And most importantly, stay updated on what's going on in the market. Knowing what's happening is powerful, especially in a situation that's as unstable and uncertain as this.
This whole situation is crazy. A housing crisis, these awful wildfires, insurance companies leaving, and renters stuck in the middle. But this analysis doesn't just point out problems, it also talks about possible solutions. What are some of the main takeaways there?
The analysis says this isn't just an LA problem. It's a small example of much bigger problems we're all facing. Climate change, affordable housing, and how insurance is changing in a world with more risks. And while those are really complicated problems, there are things we can do both individually and as a society.
Okay, so let's get into some of those possible solutions. What can we do to reduce these risks and make a more sustainable housing market in LA and everywhere else?
Well, the analysis focuses on three main areas: investing in better infrastructure, dealing with affordability issues, and changing the insurance system.
Let's start with infrastructure. What kind of investments are we talking about?
On the practical side, it's stuff like managing forests better to prevent wildfires, making sure there's space around homes to stop fires from spreading, updating utilities to make them safer, and making building codes stronger so structures can handle extreme weather. It's also about having early warning systems and good evacuation plans so we can minimize the impact of disasters.
So it's about being proactive instead of just reacting after something bad happens.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical things. We need to invest in social infrastructure too, building strong communities that can support each other during tough times.
Yeah.
Like community centers, neighborhood watch programs, and resources for vulnerable people like seniors and people with disabilities.
It's about creating a sense of resilience together where people feel connected and are ready to help each other when disaster strikes.
Right? And that leads to affordability, which was already a big problem before the fires. We have to find ways to make housing affordable for people of all income levels, especially in high-risk areas where people are being forced out of their homes.
That sounds great, but how do we actually do that? Housing is already so expensive in a lot of places.
It's a tough challenge for sure, but there are some things we could try. We could give more government money to support affordable housing, offer tax breaks to developers who build affordable units, and encourage community land trusts, which basically take land off the market and use it for affordable housing.
Those are all good ideas, but they need politicians to get on board and different groups to work together. What about insurance? What can we do to fix the system so it can handle the problems caused by climate change?
That's a big one. The way insurance works now is struggling to keep up with all these natural disasters. We need to make insurance cheaper and easier to get for the people who need it most, while also making sure insurance companies have enough money to pay out claims when disasters happen.
So we have to find a balance. We need to protect homeowners and the insurance industry at the same time. What are some specific things we could do?
Well, one idea is to encourage insurance companies to offer more flexible policies that take into account the risks of climate change, like policies that give you a discount for using fire-resistant materials or living in a community with a good fire safety plan.
So it's about rewarding people for being proactive and focusing on preventing disasters instead of just reacting to them.
Exactly. Another idea is to have the government and private companies work together on insurance, where the government steps in to help cover really big disasters. This could help keep the market stable and make insurance more affordable in high-risk areas.
So it's about sharing the risk and making sure everyone has protection. It's a big job, but it sounds like there's some options out there.
Definitely. And let's not forget what individuals can do. We can all take steps to lower our own risk, like clearing brush around our homes, using fire-resistant materials when we build, and just being more aware of the dangers in our communities.
Right. It's about giving people the information and tools they need to make smart choices that reduce their risk and help create a more resilient community. So it's not just about waiting for the government or insurance companies to fix things. We can all be a part of building a better future.
Absolutely. It's a team effort, and it starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own actions and working together to build a stronger world.
This has been a really insightful conversation. It's helped me understand just how complicated this whole issue is. We've talked about the immediate impact of the fires, the challenges of rebuilding the insurance crisis, and what renters are going through. And we've even started talking about some solutions. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about this being more than just a problem for LA.
You're right. It's important to remember that the problems we're talking about here in LA are happening all over the country and all over the world, just in different ways.
It's like this LA real estate analysis is showing us what the future might look like. We're seeing these trends everywhere. Rising sea levels are putting coastal communities at risk. Hurricanes are getting stronger and more frequent. And don't even get me started on heat waves and droughts that are making some areas practically unlivable.
Exactly. And all of these things are going to have a huge impact on housing in the years to come. We're not just talking about how much houses are worth anymore. We're talking about the basics of where and how people can live.
So this isn't just something for Californians to think about. It's something everyone needs to be aware of. What are some of the big questions our listeners should be asking themselves no matter where they live?
Start by thinking about where you live. What are the climate risks in your area? Is it prone to wildfires, floods, hurricanes, extreme heat? Then think about how the local housing market is dealing with those risks. Are insurance costs going up? Are people moving away? Are developers building homes that can handle these risks?
It's almost like you need to be a climate expert and a real estate expert just to figure out where to live.
Well, maybe not that much. But it does show that homeowners and renters need better information and resources. We need more data on climate risks, clearer rules for building codes, and better communication from local governments about how they're planning for climate change.
That's a great point. It's not just about what individuals do. It's about having a system that helps people make informed choices. But even with better information, this is still really complicated. What advice would you give to our listener who's probably feeling a little overwhelmed by all this?
I think the most important thing is to not let fear or uncertainty stop you from doing anything. The more you know about the risks and the solutions, the better you'll be able to make choices that protect you and help build a better future.
So what are some concrete steps our listener can take today, no matter where they live, to start preparing for these challenges?
Start by talking to your neighbors, your local officials, your insurance agent. Ask questions, share information, and get involved in community projects that are working on climate resilience and affordable housing. Remember, these are problems we all face, and we need to work together to solve them.
And on that note, I think we've given you a lot to think about today. We've covered a ton of information from the aftermath of the LA wildfires to the bigger impact on housing across the country. It's a complicated and constantly changing situation, but we hope this deep dive has given you some useful insights and a place to start your own research.
It's been a really interesting conversation. And while we've focused on the problems, I want to say that there are also a lot of people doing really innovative and creative things in housing and climate resilience. People are finding new ways to build stronger and more sustainable homes. Communities are coming together to help those in need, and people in government are starting to take these problems more seriously.
So there's hope, even though things are uncertain.
Absolutely. This isn't about being pessimistic. It's about being aware and taking action. We have the knowledge and the tools to build a better future, but it's going to take all of us working together to make it happen.
Well said. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a topic that's both challenging and super important. Remember, even though we focused on the LA real estate market today, what we've talked about applies to everyone. So stay informed, stay involved, and keep asking questions.
Right. And all these things are going to have a huge impact on where people can even live in the future. It's not just about property values anymore. It's about the whole foundation of housing.
Yeah. So this isn't just a California thing. It's something everyone needs to be thinking about. What are some key questions our listeners should be asking themselves no matter where they live?
Well, I'd say start with your own area. What are the climate risks there? Is it wildfires, floods, hurricanes, crazy heat? Then look at how the housing market is reacting to those risks. Are insurance premiums going up? Are people moving out? Are they building houses that can handle these problems?
It's like you almost have to become a climate scientist and a real estate expert just to figure out where to live these days.
Yeah, maybe not that extreme. But it does show that people need more information and resources. Homeowners and renters. We need more data on climate risks. Clearer rules about building codes, and local governments need to communicate better about how they're planning for climate change.
That's a great point. It's not just about personal responsibility. It's about having a system that helps people make good choices. But even with more information, this is still a lot to handle. What advice would you give to our listener who's probably feeling a little overwhelmed by all this?
I think the most important thing is to not just freeze up and do nothing because you're scared or unsure. The more you know about the risks and the solutions, the better decisions you can make to protect yourself and help build a safer future.
So what are some practical things our listeners can do today, no matter where they are, to start getting ready for these challenges?
Talk to your neighbors. Talk to local officials. Talk to your insurance agent. Ask questions. Share what you know. Get involved in community projects that are focused on climate change and affordable housing. We're all in this together, and we need to work together to solve these problems.
That's a great point. And on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about. We covered so much today, from what happens right after wildfires in LA to how this affects the whole housing market. It's complicated and things are changing all the time. But I hope this deep dive gave you some good information and a place to start your own research.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. And even though we focused on the problems, I want to point out that there are also a lot of really smart and creative people working on housing and climate solutions. People are finding new ways to build stronger, more sustainable homes. Communities are coming together to help people who are struggling, And governments are finally starting to take these problems seriously.
So there's hope, even with all the uncertainty.
Definitely. It's not about being gloomy. It's about understanding what's happening and doing something about it. We have the knowledge and the tools to create a more resilient future, but we all need to work together to make it happen.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into such an important topic. Remember, even though we talked about LA real estate today, what we discussed applies to everyone. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking questions. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.